When we think of the people who could suffer from exposure to asbestos, we might imagine tradespeople or home renovators. But in Canberra, one man has developed mesothelioma simply because of where he lived, in a house that had been treated with a dangerous form of loose fill asbestos known as Mr Fluffy. Unlike the victims of James Hardie products, there's been no way for Mr Fluffy victims to claim compensation, but that might be about to change. Craig Allen reports.
I had a good night.
Okay.
It was better.
James Wallner's daily life has become all about managing chronic pain.
Excellent, thank you. I'll see if that makes me feel happier.
Yes.
Make up 4 or 5 breakthroughs.
The government veterinary scientist was diagnosed with pleural mesothelioma last year at age 54, a deadly cancer only caused by exposure to asbestos.
The average age is 75 for someone with mesothelioma, but at 54, I felt very ripped off.
He's thrown everything at the disease, including expensive immunotherapies to squeeze a few more months out of life. But the story of how James Wallner got asbestos fibres in his lungs is anything but ordinary. He was just a toddler when the ceilings of his Canberra home were crammed with loose-fill asbestos insulation, a new product sold by an enterprising Canberra tradie, Dirk Jansen, better known as Mr Fluffy.
I knew it was a Mr Fluffy home. I just didn't think I could be that unlucky.
Most Australian asbestos victims came into contact with the substance working in construction. But for James, it traces back to an innocent childhood game his brother Bruce remembers vividly.
They left the tarpaulin with this mound of very sticky, attractive, dirty, white, fluffy stuff. And we had no idea what it was, of course, but it did make terrific floaty snowballs that exploded on impact when you threw them at your brother, and the fibres, sticking to your clothes.
So the most dangerous form of the product was left in a pile in a garage with 4 little kids to play around it.
Jumbo.
G'day, James. How are you, mate?
Former ABC broadcaster James O'Loughlin has watched the health of his childhood friend slide downhill.
It's been horrible to watch James, or I call him Jum, physically diminish over the months he's had this disease.
You got to get sick to get anyone to visit you.
I think laughing helps. Crying sometimes helps.
You can have a wallow in self-pity every now and then.
James's friends and family are angry that no one has taken responsibility and paid compensation. After a painful fight, many asbestos victims have now won compensation from the multinational construction giant James Hardie. But for victims of the relatively niche Mr Fluffy, there's no company left to sue, and governments haven't been much help either. The Mr Fluffy saga has been the subject of bitter blame shifting between the Commonwealth and ACT governments for the best part of a decade. The ACT is now helping Mr Wallner with his medical costs, but the Commonwealth is yet to admit any liability, even though it allowed the Mr Fluffy company to continue installing asbestos for years against its own department's health warnings. Mr Fluffy treated just over 1,000 Canberra homes over a decade, from 1968 to 1978, despite scientists raising concerns about the safety of his product with ACT health authorities within the first few months. At the time, these were federal agencies under Commonwealth control. The ACT wasn't given self-governance until 1989.
That memo from their Department of Health saying this guy should be stopped, this is
Mr.
a public...
Fluffy.
Yeah, Mr Fluffy. And you just think, wow, I shouldn't actually be dying.
Asbestos lawyer Jonathan Walsh says because Mr Fluffy wasn't technically breaking any laws at the time, the Commonwealth has no legal duty of care. But that shouldn't let them off the hook.
They most definitely have a moral culpability in what went on in Canberra in the 70s and early 80s. And one hopes that the Commonwealth Government gets off the bench and into the game and provides funding for any type of scheme to try and compensate these victims who can't otherwise ordinarily pursue compensation like any other victim.
Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt wrote back to the friends of James Wallner just last week, saying he was sympathetic to the request for a new safety net for asbestos victims who were not exposed through work, and confirming for the first time that federal officials are investigating the proposal of establishing such a fund. Nearly all Mr Fluffy homes have now been demolished by the ACT government, but it isn't yet clear if others who lived in them will contract the disease and find themselves in the same black hole for compensation. James Wallner's rapidly running out of options. Today, he's checking into a hospice for specialist medical care.
I'm better off concentrating on quality of life and pain management. There isn't any other magic out there that's going to cure me. It doesn't exist. These are the things I need, that's all. The prognosis is poor, and the books would say 12 months. I try not to count, but since diagnosis it's about 8 months, and I can certainly feel the disease is progressing. It's the one exposure form as a bystander where you are not eligible for compensation. So compensation to me seems important for people who follow me. I'm only one person.